The year is 1867, and we find ourselves in a poorly lit chamber within Russia's foreign ministry in St. Petersburg. Beyond the walls, frigid winds sweep across the frozen Neva River, yet the tension inside runs even colder. Assembled here are influential figures, including Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's own brother, their eyes fixed upon a world map. Their attention centers on an enormous yellow expanse dominating North America's northwestern corner. This territory stretches across vast dimensions, double the area of Texas. Within its borders lie infinite forests, majestic mountain ranges, and waterways abundant with salmon. This is land that future generations will discover holds billions in precious metals and petroleum. Yet these assembled leaders perceive no fortune when examining this map. Instead, they recognize burden. They see entrapment. They observe financial obligations beyond their capacity to meet. This domain is Russian America, the territory we recognize today as Alaska. Within months, these men will choose to liquidate it for approximately 2 cents per acre. From our contemporary perspective, this appears as perhaps history's most catastrophic property transaction. It seems utterly irrational. How could an empire dispose of continent-scale territory for less than the value of several Manhattan structures? The explanation is not Russian incompetence, nor is it ignorance of potential resources. The truth is that the Russian Empire faced bankruptcy. This narrative reveals how a superpower collapsed not from military invasion, but from accumulated debt interest. This is how the Crimean War devastated Russia's finances, and how a classified liquidation scheme became the sole method to rescue the Romanov dynasty from economic ruin. To comprehend the Tsar's decision to sell Alaska, we must rewind 11 years to 1856. Russia had just suffered defeat in the Crimean War, a devastating humiliation. For generations, Russia had terrorized Europe as the nation of infinite military might. European powers feared the Russian bear. However, the Crimean War revealed the bear as diseased and feeble. British and French forces invaded Russian territory, and despite defending their homeland, the Russians were crushed. Their weapons were obsolete. Their logistics were non-existent. Their vessels were wooden, while British ships were ironclad. Yet the military loss paled beside the economic catastrophe. Warfare demands enormous resources. To combat Britain and France, Russia printed millions of rubles. This triggered massive inflation. The ruble's value plummeted. Simultaneously, they borrowed extensively from European financial institutions for armaments. The war ended, but obligations remained. St. Petersburg's treasury stood empty. Debt service consumed massive portions of the national budget. The new Tsar Alexander II surveyed his empire and witnessed financial devastation. He understood that Russia's survival required modernization. It demanded railroad construction. It needed factory development. It required serfdom's abolition and modern economic systems. All this demanded enormous capital infusions. Yet creditors avoided lending to defeated nations. The Russian Empire's creditworthiness had collapsed. London and Paris bankers, the Rothschilds, the Barings, remained cautious. They demanded stability demonstrations before reopening their vaults. This is where Alaska becomes relevant. For Russian leadership, Alaska represented not precious holdings, but a drain on resources. The Russian-American Company, a state-sponsored corporation resembling the British East India Company, administered the colony. Unlike the East India Company profiting from India, the Russian-American Company hemorrhaged money, The sea otter population, foundation of the fur trade, faced near extinction from hunting. The company failed. It required government subsidies for basic operations. Consequently, the bankrupt Russian government also subsidized a failing enterprise on the planet's opposite side. Beyond financial concerns lurked darker geopolitical fears. Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's younger brother and Russian Navy commander, was pragmatic. He examined maps and recognized strategic disaster. Alaska shared extensive borders with Canada, a British possession. The British Empire remained Russia's primary adversary. British naval forces dominated oceans. The Grand Duke knew that renewed Anglo-Russian conflict would see British warships simply seize Alaska's ports. Russia possessed no Pacific fleet capable of defense. They could not transport troops across Siberia with sufficient speed. Alaska was indefensible. The Grand Duke composed a classified letter to Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov. Within this communication, he presented cold, calculated reasoning. He stated that the United States represented the continent's future. He projected that eventually America would seek total North American control. He argued that maintaining Alaska would ultimately result in losing it to Britain without compensation. The British would simply claim it as war spoils. Better, he reasoned, to sell now to Americans while extraction of value remained possible. This was loss-cutting strategy. This was emergency liquidation. However, complications arose. Americans were preoccupied. The late 1850s saw the United States tearing itself apart. Tensions between North and South approached breaking point. American government was paralyzed by slavery debates. They showed no interest in purchasing frozen wilderness from the Tsar. Washington's Russian ambassador, the clever and charismatic Edward de Stuckel, received instructions to wait. He was told to maintain the concept's viability, but exercise patience. Then, in 1861, the American Civil War erupted. For 4 years, the United States drowned in bloodshed. Alaska's sale was suspended, yet during this period, something remarkable occurred. Russia and the United States became close allies. This seems peculiar today given Cold War history, but during the 19th century, Russia and America were natural partners. Both despised the British Empire. During the Civil War, Britain and France secretly considered recognizing the Confederacy. They desired seeing the United States fragment into weaker nations because unified America threatened their global supremacy. Tsar Alexander II recognized this. He understood that Union collapse would strengthen Britain further. Therefore, he made a dramatic gesture. He dispatched the Russian Navy to visit New York and San Francisco ports. This sent clear signals to London and Paris: intervene in America's Civil War and face Russian opposition. The American public responded enthusiastically. They organized parades for Russian sailors. They perceived Russia as their sole, genuine European friend. This friendship would establish the Alaska Deal's foundation. When the Civil War concluded in 1865, the Union had prevailed, but the U.S. government was exhausted. They were overwhelmed by war debt. Secretary of State William Seward was an expansionist. He believed America's destiny included controlling the entire continent. He desired Alaska. He envisioned it as a bridge to Asia. He anticipated trade opportunities with China and Japan. However, he struggled convincing others. The American public was weary of warfare and expenditure. They viewed Alaska as an ice block. Newspapers labeled it Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox. They ridiculed him. They questioned his interest in purchasing a polar bear sanctuary. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, circumstances grew desperate. The Russian treasury critically lacked hard currency. Significant payments on foreign loans approached. The Tsar needed cash urgently. He summoned Stekel to the Winter Palace. The December 1866 meeting included the Tsar, Grand Duke, Foreign Minister, and Finance Minister. Finance Minister Reutern was most anxious. He presented the ledger, bleeding red. He informed the Tsar that even modest sums from Alaska's sale would stabilize the ruble and service Rothschild loan interest. They established a price. They would request $5 million, but authorized Stekel to negotiate. They instructed him to obtain maximum value, but the priority was deal closure. They needed funds by next fiscal quarter. Stekel received his orders. He traveled to Washington carrying the secret proposal. Stekel arrived in Washington during March 1867. He proceeded directly to William Seward. He found receptive audience. Seward was eager. He wanted victory to distract the public from Civil War's messy aftermath and President Andrew Johnson's impending impeachment. Seward and Stekel commenced negotiations. Stekel started high. Seward started low. They bargained over a continent's price. Yet Stekel possessed advantages. He understood Seward wanted this agreement more than American Congress did. He recognized Seward's vanity and legacy ambitions. Finally, they agreed on $7,200,000. This exceeded Russian expectations. The additional $200,000 covered existing Russian infrastructure costs. However, conditions applied. The agreement required immediate signing. Stekel wanted telegraphing the Tsar before American Congress could awaken and obstruct it. The signing story is legendary. On the night of March 29, 1867, Stekel visited Seward's residence to announce Tsar's telegraphed approval. Stekel suggested meeting the following day for treaty signing. Seward abandoned his card game and stood. He declared, "Why delay until tomorrow? Let us conclude the treaty tonight." Stekel was surprised. He protested, "But your department is closed. You have no administrative staff." Seward smiled, responding, "If you can assemble your delegation by midnight, you will find me waiting at the State Department." Therefore, during the night, Russian diplomats and American officials gathered at the State Department. Clerks were roused from sleep. Gas lamps were illuminated. They worked frantically drafting the final treaty. Maps covered tables. Boundaries were delineated. The fate of Alaska's indigenous peoples, the Tlingit, Haida, Aleut, was determined without single representative present. They were transferred between empires like property. The treaty declared that ceded territory inhabitants would receive all rights, advantages, and immunities of United States citizenship. Yet this promise would remain broken for a century. At 4 o'clock in the morning on March 30th, the treaty was signed. Seward had acquired an empire matching Western Europe's size for under 2 cents per acre. He was jubilant. He believed he had secured American safety. Stekel was relieved. He had secured Romanov dynasty liquidity. He telegraphed St. Petersburg, simply stating, "Treaty signed, $7.2 million. However, drama continued. Treaty signing differs from payment. The United States Congress required money approval. Congress was hostile. The House of Representatives was controlled by men despising President Johnson and, consequently, his Secretary of State, William Seward. They perceived the purchase as wasteful spending and a method to expand an unpopular administration's power. They threatened blocking fund appropriation. This is where the narrative shifts from high diplomacy to low corruption. Stuckel realized the deal faced danger. He had promised the Tsar money. Returning to Russia empty-handed meant disgrace. Therefore, he did what desperate lobbyists do. He resorted to bribery. The Russian government authorized a secret slush fund. Stuckel began wining and dining influential congressmen. He hired powerful lobbyists. He placed favorable newspaper articles. Thousands of gold dollars were distributed in brown paper envelopes. The Russian ambassador, representing the autocrat, was purchasing American democracy. Estimates suggest over $100,000 of the purchase price actually bribed U.S. Congress to vote favorably. This was a dirty deal conducted in shadows. But it succeeded. The House of Representatives finally voted approving funds. The check was issued. The money transfer was a complex financial operation. The U.S. Treasury issued a warrant for $7,200,000. However, Russia wanted gold, not dollars, and they wanted it in London. The warrant went to the Russian legation, who deposited it in a U.S. bank. The bank then worked with the Rothschilds, transferring the value to London, where it was converted into gold bullion and deposited into Russian government accounts. The money did not fund Russian schools or hospitals. It went almost immediately toward foreign railroad loan interest payments. Alaska's sale essentially paid the Russian railway system's mortgage for several additional years. On October 18, 1867, the official transfer ceremony occurred in Sitka, Alaska. It was somber. Russian troops lined one side of the flagpole, American troops the other. The Russian flag was lowered but became stuck. A sailor had to climb the pole, cutting it loose. It fell onto Russian bayonets, seen as bad omen. The American flag was raised. Alaska was now American soil. Most Russians living in Alaska departed. They refused living under American rule. Indigenous peoples watched with confusion and dread. They had not been conquered. They had not sold their land. Yet suddenly they had new masters speaking new languages and bringing new laws. For initial decades, critics seemed correct. Alaska was ignored. It was governed by military, then Treasury Department. It was lawless frontier. The American public forgot about it. Russia appeared to have pulled off a great scam. They had sold useless ice to gullible Americans. The $7 million was spent and gone. The Tsar had his railroad. Americans had their icebox. However, history tricks the short-sighted. In 1896, almost 30 years post-sale, a Yukon prospector found a thumb-sized gold nugget. News spread like wildfire. The Klondike gold rush began. Thousands rushed north. Millions in gold were extracted from Alaska's rivers and mountains. Within years, the United States recovered Alaska's purchase price 100 times over. Then came petroleum. During the 20th century, massive oil fields were discovered in Prudhoe Bay. Alaska's strategic value became incalculable during the Cold War. It was the first defense line against the very nation that sold it. Soviet bombers were intercepted over airspace their grandfathers sold for pennies. Radar stations protecting the United States were built on land purchased to service bad debt. Ultimately, Alaska's sale teaches the dangers of short-term thinking. The Russian Empire was so focused on immediate cash flow problems, their next quarterly debt payment, that they sold their future. They traded a continent for several years' solvency. They feared losing the territory to Britain. so they gave it to America, never realizing America would become the rival that eventually buried them. As we conclude this script's first portion, we have witnessed the sale itself. We have seen desperate men in St. Petersburg and midnight dealings in Washington. We have seen money change hands. However, another layer exists to this narrative, a layer involving European financial dynasties' specific roles and the hidden mechanisms of imperial bankruptcy. In the second part, we will examine deeper the Russian collapse's financial mechanics. We will analyze how the Rothschilds pressured the Tsar. We will examine the suppressed internal Russian debate. And we will see how Alaska's money was not the salvation the Tsar hoped for, but merely temporary bandage on a wound that would eventually destroy the empire. The Alaska transfer was complete on paper, but the deal's ghost continued haunting the Russian Empire. To understand this tragedy's true depth for Russia, we must look away from North American maps and examine the Imperial Ministry of Finance ledgers in St. Petersburg. Alaska's sale was not an isolated real estate transaction. It was a symptom of terminal illness rotting the Romanov dynasty from within. That illness was debt dependency. The Russian Empire during the 19th century was paradoxical. It was history's largest continuous land empire. It possessed the largest army. It had immense natural resources. Yet financially, it was a third-world country. It had almost no middle class. It had almost no domestic capital. If the Tsar wanted to build bridges, cannons, or palaces, he had to borrow from London, Paris, or Berlin. Russia was the world's largest debtor. The Crimean War had blown an irreparable hole in the budget. But Tsar Alexander II had vision. He wanted industrialization. He observed Britain and recognized steam engine power. He realized British power's source was not just the Navy, but the factory. He launched massive railroad construction programs. He wanted connecting Ukraine's grain fields with Baltic ports. He wanted connecting Ural mines with Moscow factories. This was noble goal, but execution was financial disaster. The Russian government guaranteed private railroad company loans. This meant that railroad bankruptcies resulted in government paying investors. It was massive subsidy for incompetence and corruption. Railroad barons took money, built shoddy tracks, and pocketed differences. The state was left holding the bag. By 1866, the year before Alaska's sale, the Russian government was spending almost one-third of its entire budget just servicing debt on these railroad loans. This is where the House of Rothschild enters the story. The Rothschilds were Europe's bankers. They had branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They were bond market masters. When governments needed money, they approached the Rothschilds. The relationship between the Tsar and the Rothschilds was complicated. The Romanovs were autocrats. They were anti-Semitic. They despised being beholden to Jewish bankers. But they had no choice. The Rothschilds were the only ones with deep enough pockets keeping the Russian Empire afloat. In years leading to Alaska's sale, the Rothschilds pressured the Russian finance ministry. They worried about ruble stability. They wanted the Russian government building gold reserves to back currency. They warned that if reserves dropped too low, future loan interest rates would skyrocket. The Tsar was trapped. He could not stop building railroads because that would mean admitting Russia was no longer a great power. But he could not afford paying for them. The $7.2 million from Alaska was a drop in the bucket compared to total debt. However, It was critical hard currency injection at a panic moment. It was liquidity. It allowed Finance Minister Reutern, showing European bankers that Russia still had cash inflows. It allowed them refinancing loans at slightly better rates. In essence, Alaska was sold to improve the Russian Empire's credit score. It was a payday loan taken by a superpower. Voices in Russia opposed the sale. Patriots and visionaries saw Pacific potential. They argued Russia should pivot east. They argued the world's future lay in the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic. They pointed out Alaska was rich in furs, fish, and potentially minerals. They said surrendering territory signaled weakness that would encourage Russian enemies. However, these voices were silenced. Grand Duke Constantine and Finance Minister Reutern controlled the Tsar's ear. They argued Russia needed consolidation. They used the word concentration. They said Russia should focus on core European and Central Asian interests. They argued Alaska was a distraction, a luxury they could not afford. They painted pictures of defenseless colonies costing money annually. They manipulated data, making the Russian-American company appear worse than reality. They suppressed reports about gold being found in Alaskan rivers. They wanted the deal completed, and they did not want facts interfering. The tragedy is, they were wrong about nearly everything. They were wrong about Alaska's defensibility. If they had kept and populated it, it would have been fortress. They were wrong about economic potential, and they were wrong about geopolitical friendship with America. They believed that selling Alaska to the United States would cement permanent alliance against Britain. They thought Americans would be grateful. They thought Americans would help them in their London rivalry. However, gratitude is not a geopolitical concept. Once Americans had Alaska, they no longer needed Russia. In fact, Alaska's purchase made America a Pacific power, which eventually brought conflict with Russia's Asian interests. By the 20th century, the friendship was dead. The two nations were enemies, and the land Russia sold to buy several years of financial breathing room became their greatest adversary's forward operating base. The money itself vanished quickly. The $7 million was absorbed into general treasury. It was used purchasing railroad equipment from abroad. Ironically, much equipment was bought from Britain and America. Therefore, the money went right back to countries that were Russia's rivals. Railroad tracks were laid, but underlying Russian economy problems, the inefficiency, corruption, backwardness, remained. Alaska's sale did not save the Romanovs. It merely delayed inevitable collapse. 50 years after the sale in 1917, the Russian Empire finally ran out of time and money. Debts piled until they were unpayable. The First World War broke the economy's back. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Bolsheviks took power. One of the new Soviet government's first actions was defaulting on all Russian Empire foreign debts. They told the Rothschilds and French banks they would not pay a single kopeck. The financial house of cards that Alexander II tried saving by selling Alaska finally collapsed. In the Soviet era, Alaska's sale became taboo subject. The communists did not want discussing how the Tsars gave away Soviet territory. However, there was lingering bitterness, a feeling that Russia had been swindled. Rumors and myths spread among Russian people. Some believed Alaska was not sold but leased for 99 years, and Americans refused returning it. Some believed the ship carrying gold from London sank and money never arrived. These myths were false but reflected deep psychological wounds, a sense of loss. Today, when you observe the Bering Strait, You see a narrow water stretch separating two worlds. On one side is Chukotka, a remote and impoverished Russian region. On the other side is Alaska, a wealthy and strategic American state. The contrast is stark. Alaska has the Trans-Alaska Pipeline carrying billions of petroleum barrels. It has major military bases. It has thriving fishing industries. It is a strategic asset of highest order. For modern Russia, Alaska's sale is the ultimate what if? What if the Tsar had held on? What if he had listened to dissenters? What if the Russian flag still flew over Juneau and Anchorage? The Cold War would have looked very different. 20th century history would have been rewritten. Russia would have had North American foothold. The Soviet Union might have placed missiles not in Cuba, but in their own North American territory. The world's geopolitical balance would have shifted on its axis. However, history is written by decisions made in desperate rooms by desperate men. The decision to sell Alaska was made by men examining balance sheets bleeding red. They were not thinking about the next century. They were thinking about the next loan payment. They were victims of short-term thinking, plaguing all declining empires. They sacrificed the eternal for the temporary. The Alaska Purchase story is usually told as American success story, Seward's folly becoming Seward's triumph. However, it is perhaps more important telling it as Russian tragedy. It is the story of how debt enslaves nations. It is the story of how financial weakness leads to territorial disintegration. The Russian Empire did not lose Alaska on battlefields. They lost it at the bank. The Rothschilds did not seize the territory, but their invisible hand forced the Tsar's pen. Therefore, next time you see a North American map and observe that giant peninsula reaching from the continent toward Asia, remember it is not just land. It is a monument to bankruptcy. It is the receipt for a bill a dying empire could not pay. It is proof that in the game of empires, the most dangerous weapon is not cannon or rifle, but a promissory note. And the most dangerous defeat is not losing a war, but running out of gold.